guys remember you guys remember the news, right? There was in 2019, or sorry, 2018, there was a flight from Jakarta, left Jakarta, and almost right away there was a problem. The terrified flight crew was struggling with the airplane because the airplane was automatically nosediving, and they did not know how to override it. They did not know what was going on. And what was happening is there was a sensor somewhere outboard the plane or inboard the plane, I'm not sure, and it was trying to, it was designed to be a safety issue. It's designed to help from a safety point of view. It's an anti-stall device. So what would happen is, if a pilot accidentally puts a nose too high in the air, if the angle of the nose goes up too high for too long, an airline will stall and it will no longer. It's pretty much what it sounds like. It will no longer work and it'll crash. So this anti-stall device was put on, but none of the pilots knew about the anti-stall device, and they didn't know how to override it. They weren't trained to do that, and because there was only one sensor and not multiple sensors, as there is everywhere else on an airplane when it comes to safety for redundancy in case one fails. So the one failed, as they sometimes do, and it has to be calibrated. It's not like it's like a permanent sensor that never has to be adjusted. It has to be calibrated, and it was miscalibrated. And so the anti-stall device, because of the faulty sensor, thought the airplane was about to stall, and so it pushed the nose down, but it wasn't about to stall. And the panic crew had no idea what was going on, and everybody on board was lost. And there was an internal FAA report that said, "Oh, this is a problem," because having just one, there were two big problems. But they said, "Okay, well, we're gonna figure out what we're gonna do," because they expected that if they did nothing, there would be 15 more crashes. But they did nothing. Shockingly, the FAA did nothing. And then less than 5 months later, there was an Ethiopian Air flight. That's not what this is. There was another 737 MAX, an Ethiopian Air flight that had the exact same thing happen to it. This time, just 3 minutes after takeoff, and everyone there died. And the pilots had no idea what was going on. They were freaking out, and then the plane crashed and everyone died. So what was happening actually is what's called regulatory capture. So it's the idea when the people who the rules are supposed to regulate are actually the ones writing the rules. And it really kind of started with this plane. There's really, it's kind of the airline industry, or the airplane manufacturing industry, is a little bit like the cola industry in the way that there's just Coke and Pepsi. There's pretty much just Airbus and Boeing. And Airbus came out with a plane in, I think, 2016, maybe a little bit earlier, called the Airbus A320neo, and it was wildly popular. And the folks, it was just a big plane. It just held a lot of people, so the airlines liked it. They could get more people because air travel is becoming more and more popular. And so these guys, the Airbus, are Boeing's European competitors, came up with this plane, and Boeing kind of freaked out, and they were in a hurry to create a competitor to this plane. But creating a new airplane from scratch takes a lot of time for obvious engineering and regulatory reasons. So what they did is they just said, we're going to take the very popular workhorse that is the 737, and we're going to just create a new one called the 737 MAX. It's going to have the features that these airlines seem to like about the Airbus, but we're going to call it more or less the same plane, so we don't have to redesign it. And when they did that, they realized a few things. One was that if they changed too many things, then they were going to have to retrain all the pilots. So all the pilots would have to do flight simulations in the new 737 MAX, and the airlines were not interested in buying new planes that they then had to retrain their pilots for. So Boeing went over and beyond, trying to make it seem like this was the same plane, to the point where the anti-stall system, which had been in the instruction book, they took it out of the instruction book because they didn't want to make it look like it was anything new. And they did, so that the airlines wouldn't have to retrain the pilots. And they were able to do all of this because the FAA had which was once kind of a proud regulator and a servant of the safety of the public, had turned into a cheerleader for the airline industry. It had kind of a weird dual mandate. One was to regulate the industry, and one was to promote it. And so, so it got to the point where the inspections were happening by the Boeing engineers. So the Boeing engineers would do the inspections, and they would approve things, and they would approve things like only having one sensor, and only having one sensor on a safety mechanism in an airplane would be like having no doors, period, in an auditorium or something like that. I mean, it is not, you know, to us, it's like, oh, that makes sense. One sensor, I guess you don't need two, but to them, that's a really big deal. But the Boeing engineer who was in charge of inspecting the Boeing for the essentially what's the architectural equivalent of code compliance, that person was a Boeing employee, and there was tremendous stress to get this plane approved and out the door. And so things like the anti-stall system were buried and not told, and intentionally not told to the pilots, so that the airlines wouldn't have to train them again. And multiple sensors were not used, even though that is just a no-brainer. And so that's what we're kind of indirectly going to be talking about today in a much lower stakes battle. But just the idea when the fox is in charge of the hen house. So the Congress, you know, came up with a report at the end. It was really just, you know, excoriated the FAA, because I guess the idea is that the, you know, to paraphrase, I forgot his name right now. He was the former Secretary of the Treasury, but he said, I don't want good corporate citizenship, I want good corporate governance. And so, and that's pretty much what Congress found out, is they found out that that Boeing's own engineers had created inherent conflicts of interest that jeopardized the safety of the flying public, and it really kind of blamed the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the federal government's watchdog for airline safety, for just a culture of rot and undercutting the authority of their own experts in favor of the we promises of the Boeing engineers. So this is the thing where I said they after the first one, after the first crash, an internal FAA document said this is a huge problem. Like, these things eventually are going to go bad. They're going to be miscalibrated, and the pilots don't know about it. We need to do something. There's going to be potentially 15 additional fatal crashes, resulting in 3,000 deaths. Now, when I was a kid, there were plane crashes like once a month. That happened all the time, like horrible plane crashes. But those just don't happen anymore. They really haven't happened for the last 20 years or so. If you look at the number of people who die, you can Google right now the number of people who die in plane crashes every year, and you see, like, beginning like in, I don't know, 1995 or something, it goes from, you know, hundreds a year and maybe 1,000 a year to basically zero. It's very safe, even though it's scary as hell to be up there for some people. And so what the question was this week is, an architect designing a train station and construction manager as advisor project delivery has hired an AV consultant to design the PA system. A loudspeaker company is offered free of charge to write a performance specification. The owner's priority is lowering the cost of the project or keeping to the budget. Who should write the text of the loudspeaker specifications? The answer is the AV consultant should write it. Now, of course, the architect is responsible for the specs, as, you know, the kind of final editor or publisher of the specs. But all kinds of people have their grubby little hands in the specs. The consultants have their hands in the specs. There may be advice from the CM in the specs. Manufacturers may write the text that's copy and pasted into specs by the architect. Certainly software gets into the specs. Sometimes Expeditors content gets into the specs. Sometimes there are for-hire spec writers that are professional spec writers. And of course, their content gets into the specs. And you guys can go ahead and put in the chat what other random person has inserted what they need into the specs. Now, what are the specs themselves? The specs are like the fine print. They're like the rules of the game for the project, and they often total over 1,000 pages long, even for a project of medium complexity. They can get pretty long, and so they're organized in a very. There's certain things you're going to have to know for the exam. They're organized in a very specific way. that follows the master spec format, which is well, sometimes unit. Well, there are different types of formats it can follow, but as far as the exam is concerned, you want to follow the master spec format. There are what else do you have to know about specs? You have to know that when there's a conflict, the specs trump the drawings. You have to know that the specs are part of the contract document. So when the bidder wins the bid and becomes the contractor, that contractor is signing a legal agreement to build what's in the specifications. You have to know that a whole bunch of people have their grubby little hands in the specs, and you have to know what type of specs are kind of NCARB approved and what kind of specs are frowned upon for cost reasons, and we're going to get to that in a second. So we could have the architect write it, but what the hell did the architect pay an AV consultant to do? The AV consultant surely knows more about loudspeaker performance specifications than the architect does, I would hope. Otherwise, why hire the AV consultant? Now, the CM would be an unlikely party to write specs on a PA system. Again, especially if there's an AV consultant. The loudspeaker manufacturer would love to write the specs. They would love to do that. And that's where this kind of regulatory capture parable that I told you at the beginning with the plane crash comes in, because they will write the specs such that their particular brand is going to be the one purchased. So in fact, they may offer to do the AV consulting for free. And I'm going to put free in air quotes here because it's not really free, because they're going to over specify and write the specs so that only the loudspeakers of that manufacturer qualify for the project. Then they're going to have the project by the you-know-whats and the contractor by the you-know-what, and they're going to be able to tell the contractor, that'll be $110,000 for the loudspeakers. And the contractor will say, what? That's crazy. And they'll, take it or leave it. And the contractor has already agreed to build the building, often for a fixed price. So the quote that they're going to get is the quote that's going to eventually probably be passed on to the owner in the higher bid to begin with. So we don't want, as far as NCARB is concerned, we don't want manufacturers or building supply, we don't want them writing the specs, because they're essentially writing the rules. And it's not just that we don't want them to, there's two issues. One is we want to give the contractor freedom to be able to, work with a product that she's more familiar with, or work with a product that works better in their particular climate, or work with a product that is available with a shorter lead time. So we want to give the contractor that kind of flexibility. But most importantly, we want the contractor and the project, and therefore the owner, to benefit from the lower cost that almost always happens when there's competitive bidding. And so if there are 3 different manufacturers of loudspeakers that the contractor goes to get a bid, that $110,000 worth of loudspeakers may be more like $15,000. Well, that may be a bit extreme, but maybe more like $80,000 or something like that. So, and those numbers maybe all are a little bit high for a train station, but we'll say it's a pretty sophisticated train station. And so we want to make sure, we want to empower the contractor to be able to go to multiple suppliers and see who's the lowest price that meets. But still, we want to have loudspeakers that work and that have the appropriate, spread, which is just what you think if this is the loudspeaker kind of mounted on the ceiling. This spread, this angle here is called the spread, and we want the appropriate spread, and we want them mounted appropriately so that they don't fall off, and so that they don't rattle when the loudspeaker is speaking loudly, and so forth. So there's lots of reasons why we want to be able to say in the specs, and probably not in the drawings, because it would pretty much cloud up the drawings if we said, if the drawing said that the loudspeaker shall achieve a non-distorted, 1000 hertz pure tone value at, at 94 decibels, that would be a lot to put in the drawings if you had to do that for each material that you that you included. So that's why these specs get pretty long, but that's also why they're separate. So the specs themselves, I mentioned, they're part of the bidding documents. They're part of the project manual, which is pretty much all the 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that are associated with the project. They're part of the, certainly part of the contract documents. That's pretty important to know as well. So if we're going to put these loudspeakers up, we're going to have to write specs for it. Now, what the specs look like, there are at least 6 different types of specs, and there are 3 that are bad, and there are 3 that are good. Now, in reality, of course, any spec book will have all of these, and sometimes even with one particular loudspeaker spec, it may have all 6 versions of this. But proprietary is just what it sounds like. You have to use this particular brand. So proprietary, if it's a closed proprietary, you have to use, it might say you have to use JBL, which is a type of loudspeaker. And then that's when the contractor is really has one hand tied behind her back. In an open proprietary spec that's a bit better, it may say JBL or equivalent. So in that case, it allows the contractor a little leeway, but it really puts the contractor in a bit of a bind, because the contractor is probably not in a position to determine what's equivalent to JBL. You know, is this other brand equivalent to JBL? Maybe, I don't know, maybe not. So it puts them in a little bit of a bind where they want to use a cheaper one, but they're really not sure it can. Prescriptive specs are pretty much like know-it-all specs. So they're saying they might tell the contractor the loudspeaker shall be attached with 2 3/8 long tapered wood screws, affixed at a minimum of 4 different points, and so forth. But in reality, even though you think architects might be, you know, that might be our job, it really isn't. Those of you guys who have experience, you know, I think in school we kind of tell some students that maybe that's part of what architecture is. At least we sometimes do that, frankly, here at Virginia Tech, where I teach studio and other courses. But in reality, in practice, the materials and means, methods, and materials of construction are the purview of the contractor for good reason. They know what screws they have available in the truck, and they're pretty good at understanding how to mount a loudspeaker so it doesn't fall down. You know, we don't have situations where loudspeakers are falling down and hurting people all the time. And so we want to give the contractor, or more appropriately, probably the subcontractor's laborer, a little bit of leeway and not have to go down, you know, climb down off the scaffolding and check the specs to see what type of screw needs to attach it. So prescriptive. Now, there are times when we want a proprietary spec, including a closed proprietary spec. If you want a particular type of ceiling fan, because ceiling fans are so ugly, but they don't have to be, but a few are good looking, and you want that ceiling fan because it's not as ugly as the other ones, that is a great reason to put a closed proprietary spec on. If everybody knows what's equivalent to a zip system or something like that, where there's a really well-known brand and there are others that are equivalent, maybe an open proprietary spec is appropriate. And there are times when we need prescriptive specs. There may be a time, for whatever reason, when we want to tell the contractor specifically that we want a certain kind of screw head because it looks better, it's just prettier, and it's going to be visible all over the deck, and we want those kind of little square screw heads. And so we may put something in there that is quite prescriptive and explains to the contractor exactly what to do. Or likewise, we may have a structural reason, like we may want to tighten the bolts to a very specific torque, and so we would want to be prescriptive in that sense. However, when it's not a really good reason to be proprietary or prescriptive, and especially if budget is a concern, which it almost always is, we do not want proprietary or prescriptive specs. So if you are given a choice in the exam and it says, and 2 of the choices are open and closed proprietary, and the 3rd choice is prescriptive, I can almost guarantee it's going to be the 4th choice, depending on what the specific question is. And these are the ones, descriptive, performance, and reference. These are the ones that that you want. Now, descriptive spec, it depends. There's different definitions, frankly, of the descriptive spec. But the descriptive spec is anything that's not one of those first 3. So it's one that doesn't, especially the first 2. It's one that does not. Generally, it's one that does not call out the name brand, but just generally explains it in some other way. So in some ways, and as you might imagine, in real life, these aren't all different. Some performance specs are also descriptive specs, and some reference specs are also descriptive specs. But that's a descriptive spec where you're basically just describing the loudspeaker without specifying a brand and without specifying exactly how the contractor is going to be fastening the loudspeaker. A performance spec will say that's probably your best bet in many cases. Well, that and reference are your best bet. Well, any of these three really are your best bet on the exam. A performance spec is a spec that will say the loudspeaker shall have a maximum at 1000 hertz, a maximum spread of 34 degrees in the vertical and 29 degrees in the horizontal. It shall be mounted at 45 degrees to the ceiling, with its center point aimed at aimed at the middle of the waiting area. It shall be 120 volt. It shall be this many watt, and so forth, to determine. So a performance spec describes the performance, as you might imagine, describes the performance of the call out without necessarily telling us a name brand. A reference spec also does that, but a reference spec will reference a established ASTM or ANSI or California Water Board of, pertaining to the San Joaquin Valley, or, whatever. Basically, a reference spec, rather than calling everything out, the performance, will say the loudspeaker shall meet the Acoustical Society of America's reference ASTM 2113. I'm making this up, there is no such reference, but 2113.2, the most recent version. And that way you can kind of leave it up to the experts in the Acoustical Society of America or the Institute of Noise Control Engineering, or one of these other kind of trade groups or industry groups, or they're not really industry groups, they're more like the AIA for acousticians, right? So one of those groups can get together, and they get together every 6 months and they talk about, oh, did you see that JBL has a new loudspeaker out that uses a different technology? Maybe we need to update the spec to include that technology because it looks pretty promising. And then someone will say, yeah, it looks promising, but it's a lot heavier than the other technology, and so we're going to have to put something in here about how it's fastened. And so the reference spec then references the other experts who themselves are always updating the spec, and that way it's not even up to the knowledgeable AV consultant, it's up to the industry standard. And you can imagine that's also in court, much easier way to defend something than writing your own performance spec, because you're saying, hey, look, the entire industry, this is their reference. This is the Underwriters Laboratory, meets the flame spread for Underwriters Laboratory, 4112, most recent version, and so forth. So there's all these kind of, basically they're just a bunch of nerds who just geek out on this stuff and keep track of it. Bye, good night, get licensed.